Let's get the actual details on what's happening in Florida from the man who's in charge of the education system down there. Manny Diaz is the Commissioner of Education for the state of Florida, and he joins us now. Manny, great to have you with us, sir.
Thanks for having me, Vince. Great to be with you here. And it's just incredible how obsessed the Biden White House is with Florida and with Governor DeSantis and willing to go to these extents to lie about probably the most comprehensive standalone African-American history standards in the country, and yet try to convert something, lie about something, just to attack Florida and attack Governor DeSantis.
Now, I talked about some of this on Friday, and it struck me that it seems like the Biden administration is mad that Florida is teaching too much about history, actually. But give us a sense, if you will, untangle what we're witnessing and what's really happening in Florida.
Well, what's really happening is that we passed a bill that says we were going to expand our African-American history standards. We had, since 1994, we've had them. However, these are standalone standards. They were built by a 13-member work group, which is made up of scholars, many of them African-Americans, including Dr. William Allen, who's very prominent and has been out there speaking about this. And we let them go to work on these standards to give us the unvarnished truth, the ugliest parts of American history. Slavery, free slavery, and the transport of those slaves and the atrocious conditions, post-Civil War Reconstruction, Jim Crow laws, all of the discrimination that occurred, the Ku Klux Klan, all of that, all of the rights they didn't have and had to fight for, all of that is covered in these standards. And yet Kamala Harris comes down here to try to talk about one clarification and try to turn it into saying that slavery was beneficial. We're saying slavery was beneficial for slaves.
Well,
slavery is not beneficial for any enslaved people. However, there are stories of individuals that, despite the atrocities were going on, despite the conditions and being owned, found a way to acquire skills. And that story of those individuals also has to be told within the story of African-American history.
Right. And what any normal person who looks at these standards sees is you're talking about people who were enslaved, who were resilient in the face of that atrocity, who were resourceful in the face of that atrocity, and then upon gaining their freedom and fighting for their freedom, were able to use the skills that they had acquired for themselves in order to, make an income, sustain a living in the wake of slavery. And so these are real features of American history, and yet it seems like Kamala Harris and the people who share her position on this, whatever that position is, are much more interested in the erasure of that resiliency rather than in the celebration and the acknowledgement of it.
That's correct. And actually, there are stories of those that use skills to buy themselves out of slavery, buy their freedom. And that is a testament to the individual resilience, the will, and the strength of the enslaved individuals. And when you tell the story, the entire story, yes, you're talking about this while it's going on, while these atrocities are happening to them, while they're in these situations, to have that resilience. That story, as Dr. Allen has eloquently stated, has to be told, is part of the truth.
Yeah, just so we get some context here, Dr. William Allen, he's a black man himself. He was on Jesse Waters' show on Fox this week. And he talks about, Kamala Harris is lying here. Take a listen to this.
Permit me not to give you Kamala Harris's motives. They are invisible. I don't know them. We can all have suspicions that there's a dishonest purpose afoot. But what's more important than that dishonest purpose is the truth. And this curriculum is devoted to telling the truth, whereas Kamala Harris has retailed a lie. Now, it may only have been a falsehood the first time she stated it. But when you repeat a falsehood, it becomes a lie.
What can you even explore what the reason would be for lying about something like this? Why are they lying about Florida's curriculum?
Again, because it's clear that the Biden administration, the White House, is obsessed with Florida, obsessed with Governor DeSantis, and what they're trying to do is they're creating this lie to try to put it on Governor DeSantis. When you have the truth here directly from one of the individuals who created this curriculum, this benchmarks, telling you the truth. In fact, he is a direct descendant, as he says in that interview. His great-grandfather was enslaved. And
Yes.
So you have scholars who have written this, and we did that. We wanted a work group of scholars to put this together because what we wanted is unvarnished history. We wanted the truth, and we didn't want anybody at our department eliminating or editing any of that. And so this work group worked for months and did the hard work to get to these standards.
Well, one of the ironies of all of this is that the revised standards include that notable Americans of African descent would be discussed in the classroom, to include people like Clarence Thomas and Vice President Kamala Harris. Her name appears in this. Do you think she knew that she was actually featured in this educational system?
I'm not sure she read the standards, because had she read the standards like any other person, when you look at the depth and breadth of these standards, where it talks about all the atrocities, where it talks about the Ku Klux Klan, where it talks about the rights that African Americans did not have and had to fight through the civil rights movement to attain, anybody who reads that sees that this is a comprehensive standard. By the way, Vince, there are only about a dozen states that have these standards, and Florida expanded on them. So on top of the effort to expand using, scholars, you have this White House demagogue, and you use Kamala Harris as just a political tool to take cheap shots at Florida and at Governor DeSantis.
Right. Also, I do wonder to what extent they may be nervous that students will learn about the histories of the respective political parties, because once students actually start studying the founding and history of the Democrat Party, they'll suddenly begin to realize how deeply intertwined with slavery that party was in both its birth and existence.
And that's why having accurate, factual history is important, to present to the students and let them formulate their own opinion. It is not for us to put in our standards, or for the work group to put in the standards, to push them in that direction.
Right.
But you lay out the facts and you present them to the students so they can arrive at these conclusions based on facts. Again, unfortunately, you have a White House coming down here to try to gaslight folks. And again, the obsession with Florida and the obsession with Governor DeSantis is very unusual.
One of the other features of in the conversation about slavery that you lay out in these guidelines is not just about the American slave trade, but broadly the global slave trade, how it got started, the nations that relied on it, slavery throughout history. This all seems like the kind of deeply important historical context that any student would benefit from, and yet Kamala Harris and company are outraged about it.
Not only that, but even as you talk about that era before slavery starts in America, the beginnings of that slave trade and that passage from Africa through these Europeans that started the slave trade from Africa, that passage through the atrocities, the death, the horrible conditions, all of that is covered in these standards to understand where all of this came from, how it arrived here, and then how it played out, and all of the atrocity, all the truths of what occurred. But at the same time, having the stories of individuals in the same time period being able to have their stories told as they persevered and were resilient throughout, despite these atrocities, and fighting through it. And those are examples that are part of that history, and it is important that students have the entire story. In no way is that indicating slavery is beneficial.
Right.
What it indicates is the resiliency of those individuals that were enslaved and their stories.
Yes, and they should not be erased, despite the efforts of the White House. Here is Joe Biden, again, in the opposite world that they represent, today saying that, directly implying that this involves Florida, that Florida is banning books and banning history. Here he is.
Father Parent, do you ever think we'd be talking about banning books in America? Banning history? I'm serious.
Does that resemble what's happening in Florida?
Nothing could be further from the truth. I think, in the press conference that the governor had that I was able to attend, a video was shown, Vince, showing the kind of books that were removed from libraries by local school boards using a process that exists in Florida. You know what happened? The media outlets cut their feed because they were concerned they were going to be fined by the FCC because of the graphic nature of the content. Yet those same people want to have those books left in an elementary or middle school or high school library.
Yes.
I think it's important to understand we have to stand with the truth. And when you have a process, we're not banning books. Randy Weingarten from the Teachers Union tweeted out, Florida bans To Kill a Mockingbird, only to have us respond, oh, actually, To Kill a Mockingbird is listed on our recommended reading list for our new standards. So you can see the gaslighting goes on and just flat out lies.
Yes.
And it continues with these standards.
Now, I wanted to actually, I'm so glad you brought up To Kill a Mockingbird, because that is the example I constantly think of in terms of book banning and stopping books from being disseminated in schools. The left has engaged in a years-long campaign to ban books like To Kill a Mockingbird, George Orwell's 1984, Of Mice and Men. As the guy who runs the education system down there, Manny Diaz is who we're speaking with, the Commissioner of Education for the state of Florida. Do you ever get these kind of pitches? Is there ever pressure on you to ban these great classics from the left?
Absolutely not. But in fact, didn't California, I may be mistaken, didn't California ban To Kill a Mockingbird? Wasn't that a controversy in California?
Yeah, it was. It wasn't. I don't know if it was the whole state, but there was I think a school district there that, yeah, this is a lefty phenomenon to ban these classics.
At Florida, who are being gaslit and accused of banning books, has To Kill a Mockingbird as a recommended reading. It is important that our students have access to the classics, but having access to the classics and books that have educational value doesn't mean that you allow a graphic book showing two boys learning how to masturbate with each other into a bottle to be allowed on the shelves of a library or a classroom. I think that's where you see the realities of what goes on.
Honestly, it was so gross to even hear you describe it on radio that just reminded me it should not be in a classroom. So I appreciate you sharing that with us. Manny Diaz, Commissioner of Education for the state of Florida, thank you for your time today. Please keep up the good work in the face of all this nonsense. Thank you.